Our place in the hierarchical system within society plays a role in shaping our identity and thoughts, often manipulating us like puppets. So, what is the cause of this thinking? Date: August 15th, 1971, a calm Sunday morning. Police sirens are heard in Palo Alto, California. The police begin an operation targeting university students. The students are taken from their homes one by one, and their homes are raided on charges of armed robbery or theft. After being taken out of their homes, the students are searched, handcuffed, and then taken away in police cars. All of their belongings are confiscated at the police station, and they are blindfolded and placed in a cell. This is the point where the suspects will seek answers to the question, how did I end up in this situation? So what had these students really done? What were their crimes? Their crime was participating in an experiment. In reality, these students were not the actual culprits. None of the charges were real. These students were participants in an experiment. In other words, they were the subjects of a famous psychological experiment known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. They're not guilty, I said. But at the end of this experiment, which will last about 6 days, it will be necessary to reconsider this. This is the story of how ordinary people can turn into completely different individuals in just a few days. Perhaps some people are generally aware of the experiment, but I want to share all the details with you, and in the end, ask quite a few questions and maybe search for answers together. Yes, all of these procedures, such as picking up the subjects from their homes in armored vehicles, putting them in reverse handcuffs, and reading them their rights, were done to maximize the realism of the experiment and to increase the psychological pressure on the subjects from the very beginning of the experiment. You can imagine. So, what was the purpose of all this? Why were these young people taken into custody? In fact, this experiment was set up by Philip Zimbardo, one of the leading professors at Stanford University, to measure and analyze how people react based on the roles they hold in society. In other words, it was a cruel prisoner and guard game. The experimenter and owner of the experiment, Stanford University psychology professor Philip Zimbardo, was absolutely meticulous and wanted to leave no room for ambiguity. He was very careful to ensure that all conditions, such as the procedures of being arrested, detained, and imprisoned, matched reality exactly. For this purpose, he even constructed a mini-prison in the basement of Stanford University's psychology department, built to the exact scale with real prison materials. He advertised in a newspaper announcing that he was looking for participants in a social experiment, offering $15 per day, which is approximately equivalent to $115 in today's value. Out of the 75 applicants, 24 male students were selected. There would be 9 prisoners, 9 guards, and 3 reserves. Who would be a prisoner and who would be a guard would be decided randomly through a coin toss. The prisoners would stay in the prison 24/7 for 2 weeks, while the guards would work in shifts, with a maximum of 3 guards on duty at the same time, organized into 3 shifts. Zimbardo had defined the purpose of the experiment as, how do social norms form? What are the effects of social labels, statuses, and expectations on individuals? What transpired during the experiment and its results are perhaps the most striking and chilling in the history of psychological experiments. I mentioned Zimbardo's emphasis on realism. For this purpose, he had consulted with the Palo Alto Police Department and real prison guards from a nearby prison. With the guidance of these consultants, on the first day at the police station, the participants were subjected to standard procedures before being arrested and thrown into the prison. They were stripped completely naked and searched, and their hair was shaved to the skin. They were washed with medicated spray and high-pressure water, both to prevent the possibility of lice or fleas and to break down their sense of self. As you can guess, the aim here was a form of psychological humiliation and breakdown. Such practices were almost standard in American prisons of that era. Later, all the prisoners were given uniforms with their assigned inmate numbers written on them. They also had chains on their legs. Each prisoner was addressed by their number rather than their names. Now they all had shaved heads, wore identical uniforms, and were reduced to mere numbers, having lost their sense of self. Whether you are guilty or not, how would you feel in the face of such an application? This is actually the question that needs to be pondered. On the other hand, the students who took on the role of guards were not given any formal guard training. They were simply told, "You are free to do whatever you deem necessary within the limits to maintain order in the prison and earn the respect of the prisoners." For this, the student guards had to come together to establish their own rules and enforce them. Of course, they were also warned about the dangers of the job by the real guards who served as consultants. All the guards were dressed the same way, in khaki uniforms and with large sunglasses with mirrored lenses. They were instructed to keep their sunglasses on at all times. The reason for this was to create distance between them and the prisoners and to avoid revealing their emotions through eye contact. The idea of wearing sunglasses was devilishly clever and in fact quite logical. After all, we do say that the eyes are the windows to the soul. The first day had been completed as I described earlier. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the experiment would officially begin. At the stroke of 2:30, all the prisoners were abruptly awakened from their sleep with loud noises for a head count. Several times during the day and regularly at night, these head counts continued. Of course, the prisoners were addressed by their numbers during these counts, emphasizing that their names didn't matter, that they were just a number. But most importantly, through these head counts, the guards began to establish a form of authority over the prisoners. Perhaps because the students hadn't fully embraced their roles yet, neither the guards nor the prisoners took this head counting very seriously during the first count. However, the guards, bothered by the prisoners' lack of seriousness, decided to issue their first punishment that night. They demanded that prisoners who didn't follow the rules do push-ups. While it may sound somewhat innocent and simple, it's worth noting that push-up punishments were one of the most commonly used torture methods in Nazi concentration camps. Unknowingly, the guards had taken the first step that would lead to things taking a bizarre turn. One of the guards went even further and stepped on the back of one of the prisoners doing push-ups, or he demanded that other prisoners sit on their fellow inmates' backs. But this was just the beginning. Things took a very strange turn on the morning of the second day. For reasons unknown, all the prisoners had started a rebellion that morning. They tore off their assigned numbers, piled their beds in front of the iron door to create a barricade, and insulted the guards with extremely degrading language. At that very moment, new guards had arrived to start their morning shift, and they too confronted the night shift guards in response to this situation. They accused them of being too relaxed and responsible for letting things escalate to this point. Nevertheless, they had a rebellion to quell. They called in the 3 reserve guards who had not yet participated in the experiment, and the night shift guards volunteered to stay. They held a meeting immediately and decided to respond to violence with violence. First, they used fire extinguishers to intervene, keeping the prisoners away from the iron doors. Then, they entered the cells and forcibly stripped all the prisoners naked, gave one of the prisoners they believed to be the instigator of the rebellion a solitary confinement punishment, and began exerting immense pressure on the remaining prisoners. Then, in their meeting, the guards decided that this couldn't be continually resolved with violence and that resorting to psychological pressure and tactics was necessary. They opened a privileged special cell for this purpose. The 3 prisoners who hadn't participated in the rebellion were placed in this special cell. They were given back their clothes and beds, allowed to take showers, and ate very nice meals in front of the other prisoners. Immediately afterward, they put 1 or 2 of these well-behaved prisoners back into the bad cells and took 1 or 2 of the prisoners they viewed as troublemakers into the privileged cell, granting them the same privileges. This created significant confusion among the prisoners, and the idea emerged that those who had previously been in the bad cells and were later moved to the privileged cell might be informants or spies. When they asked a former inmate who had become a consultant, they learned that this tactic was used almost identically in real prisons. The fact that these students began to implement these tactics without any prior knowledge or planning is where things started to go completely awry. Because after this rebellion, a different kind of collaboration had started to emerge among the guards. It had ceased to be a simple experiment and had become a power struggle. The guards began to see the prisoners as troublemakers and decided to increase the pressure. Every action of the prisoners was now under strict scrutiny by the guards. Even going to the restroom required permission from the guards. Unregulated, even inhumane and arbitrary rules that could be considered illegal, even in regular prisons, were being applied. In fact, the prisoners were now allowed to use a bucket in their rooms to relieve themselves after the lights went out at 10 p.m., and they had to empty these buckets themselves in the morning. And within just 36 hours of what was planned to be a 2-week experiment, the first participant, designated as 8612, began to behave uncontrollably.
14 years. Practically the length of time I've been away from Phil Zimbardo's experiment.
Fucked up inside. I feel really fucked up inside. You don't know. I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I can't say that. I'm fucked up. I don't know how to explain it. I'm all fucked up inside. Help me out! Help me out now! God damn it. Fucked up. You don't know.
Everyone, including the experimenter Zimbardo, had decided that this participant was pretending to act this way to deceive them. As a result, this particular prisoner was offered that he would never be subjected to pressure again in exchange for becoming an informant, and he was sent back to his cell to consider the offer. In the next head count, this prisoner shouted to the other prisoners, "There's no way out of here! We're stuck!" This was a turning point for the other prisoners. They started to think that this might not be an experiment, that they had really been arrested, and that they might not be able to get out of there. Finally, the authorities, who had become convinced that prisoner 8612's psychological state was indeed deteriorating, would remove him from the experiment. The next day, the management, thinking that the families would be concerned about the situation, organized a meeting between the families and the students. However, from top to bottom, everyone was so immersed in their roles that they even subjected themselves to searches and strict control upon entering the fake prison where the experiment took place. When some of the parents expressed concern about their children's well-being and complained to Zimbardo, he responded by saying, "Is your son too weak to handle this?" This particularly struck a chord with the fathers and effectively shut down serious complaints. The guards took their paranoia a step further and became paranoid that the recently released prisoner 8612 might plan a major escape for those left behind. All units went on high alert against this possibility, with personnel stationed at every exit, and everyone was put on duty. While this paranoia was mainly among the students playing the role of guards, the guards increased the pressure on the prisoners significantly. They resorted to mentally breaking the prisoners by assigning degrading tasks like cleaning toilets with their hands. At this point, Zimbardo invited a priest to the prison to talk to the prisoners. Despite being told not to, the priest acted as he normally would in a prison, and in one of the most interesting aspects of the experiment, more than half of the prisoners introduced themselves to him using their prison numbers. The priest asked them, "What are you doing to get out of here?" The prisoners didn't quite understand this question. The priest then asked, "Do you have a lawyer?" and told them that they could arrange for a lawyer if they wanted one. Strangely, some of the prisoners accepted this offer. This blurred the line between reality and the experiment even further. Now, all the prisoners and guards, including Dr. Zimbardo himself, had fully embraced their roles and had completely lost their sense of reality. Different roles emerged among the guards, with some adopting an incredibly harsh approach, while others were more lenient. The final rebellion came from prisoner number 416. After prisoner 8612 was removed from the experiment, prisoner 416 took his place. When the former prisoners told this new student, "There's no way out of here," this participant suddenly lost control and began a hunger strike, saying he wouldn't eat unless they let them go. Despite the efforts of the guards, this prisoner refused to eat and was given a cell punishment. Among themselves, the guards extended the maximum 1-hour cell punishment they had previously established to 3 hours. They also told the other prisoners, "If you give up your blankets, your friend can get out." But none of the prisoners gave up their blankets to try to help the new prisoner get out. Eventually, the prisoner was removed from solitary confinement, but when he became medically distressed upon release, it demonstrated that the experiment, especially the control of the guards, had spiraled out of control. By the 5th day, things had gotten seriously out of control, and the experiment, which was supposed to last for 2 weeks, was terminated prematurely. However, the sole reason for ending the experiment early was not just the families seeking legal action. So, what was it? Zimbardo and his assistants were monitoring what was happening through cameras during the day, but at night, the guards, believing there was no one watching them, and based on reports, began engaging in acts of cruelty towards the prisoners in areas where the cameras couldn't see, including sexual harassment. One of the reasons the experiment was terminated prematurely was because even an experienced social psychologist like Professor Zimbardo couldn't foresee how quickly those in positions of power could spiral out of control. After the experiment, when individual interviews were conducted with all the participants, an interesting revelation emerged. While all the prisoners were relieved that the experiment had ended, most of the students who played the role of guards expressed regret over the early termination of the experiment. One of the most thought-provoking aspects of the results of this experiment is perhaps the following. The participants in this study, these students, had the ability to communicate as they wished in their roles as guards and prisoners. Yet, they became so immersed in their given roles that they engaged in such dehumanizing treatment. Even Zimbardo, the designer of the experiment, allowed these degrading behaviors to continue for a while to see where things were heading. He himself admitted much later, "Only a few people were able to maintain their moral values in the face of power, and I definitely wasn't one of those strong individuals." What we can take away from this experiment is essentially how societal roles can seize control of our sense of self, or in other words, how we become entrapped by roles, status, or labels. These young men, who could have shared a coffee and a chat at university, suddenly, when one of them gained power, began to oppress the other. On the other hand, the group subjected to humiliation and violence initially resisted, but later lost their resistance. Instead of experiencing a decrease in suffering, as would be expected, the ones in power increased the dosage of violence. They justified their actions by clinging to their roles or the idea that this is what their job entailed. They failed to realize that they were becoming corrupt and engaging in what can be described as power poisoning. We've all encountered individuals like this in our lives, those who become tyrannical when they gain power or authority. Perhaps, unknowingly, some of us have been one of them. This experiment illustrates something more profound. When we engage in bullying and assign people to specific roles, we often imprison them within those roles, and in doing so, may even deprive them of opportunities in life. It demonstrates that a single word or label, like stupid, failure, weak, fat, ugly, short, tall, poor, dirty, or lazy, can have a significant impact on a person's life. Of course, it would be foolish to attribute everything to human nature and ignore the connection between the concept of becoming a monster and psychology. Long story short, don't be a dick and be wise while choosing to become a wolf or the sheep. Also, it would be awesome if you subscribe and leave a like. Take care yourselves until my next video.